Much of the story of women artists and the art they have created remain in shadow, yet to be discovered and appreciated. Productions, for the most part, have concentrated on the most famous ones, who have managed to become part of the canon of the history of art. But in order to fully appreciate and understand the important contributions of women artists, it's essential that we expand our study to include some lesser-known ones and explore the issues they've faced, the hurdles they've overcome, and the art inspired by their unique vision. Thanks to the decades of sage collecting practices of my museum, our collection has numerous fine pieces of art by women from a variety of time periods and cultures. So please join me as we discover the women of vision at the Museum of Art and Archaeology. My interest in the underrepresentation of women in the history of art and in museums came to the forefront with one of our museum's most recent acquisitions, a terracotta portrait bust of Model by the African-American artist Beulah Ecton Woodard. Born in 1895 in Cook County, Ohio, this artist has received very little recognition. She specialized in sculpture in a variety of media, including terracotta, bronze, wood, papier-mâché, and she also occasionally painted. Her fascination with African culture began at the age of 12 when a native African visited her family. This interest continued throughout her life as she explored the portrayal of Africans and African Americans, often from an ethnographic and anthropologic perspective. In high school, Woodard studied architectural drawing in preparation for a career as an architect. In 1926, she began experimenting in clay, but her family dissuaded her from pursuing it further, undoubtedly feeling that a career as a sculptor was not suitable for a young woman. Beulah Ecton Woodard, fortunately for us, soon returned to sculpture after her marriage to Brady Woodard, who must have been a feminist at heart. Louise Bourgeois was one of the leading talents in American art in the second half of the 20th century. While she exhibited with the abstract expressionists early in her career, her style came to rely on recognizable forms and symbols to communicate her message. Women throughout history were, and often still today, are primarily identified with the home, as her print powerfully expresses. Women and houses, women and domesticity. The home is shown as essentially a female place. The woman's identity is obscured and subsumed by the domestic realm. In response to the question of whether this is really art, I respond that contemporary feminist art isn't always pretty. That is because there is an underlying message that infuses and therefore guides the composition. While aesthetic issues are also explored, this is done in relation to meaning. These pieces can also question our contemporary aesthetic preferences, which have been defined by the male viewpoint for millennia. Aesthetic pleasure is not the primary purpose of this art. Instead, feminist art is supposed to make you question the world around you, the status quo, and to think again about things from a different light. According to Beulah Woodard, the primary purpose of art was to educate. She wanted to teach African Americans to take pride in their African heritage as she worked to establish an independent African American identity for Black Americans. While we often take the issue of self-identity for granted today, young Black people in the first half of the 20th century were without this, and as you can imagine, probably felt quite lost at times. Because of the educational component that she felt art should embody, she avoided abstraction and sought to realistically portray her subjects. This bust of Model shows her straightforward and easily understandable approach to art. The sculpture's power to enchant can be seen in the people who look at her. They interact with the sculpture, which appears to actively respond to them. This is thanks to the marvelous skill of the artist, who successfully captured the model in all 360 degrees of her reality. This sculpture is meant to be viewed from innumerable angles, not just from the primary cardinal points. Model Bass-Weston was about 30 years of age when Woodard sculpted her in the 1930s. She was a well-known African-American concert dancer who was the first Black American to study with the choreographer Lester Horne, and she danced with the American Ballet Theatre in Agnes de Mille's ballet, Black Ritual. Woodard's sculpture captures that lively essence of Model. The bust seems to breathe with life. The pose is a remarkably complex one thanks to the turn and tilt of Model's head. Her dramatic beauty, combined with the medium of terracotta, which is basically baked clay, give the bust a potent presence. A fundamental medium of artistic expression, clay, even after firing, reveals traces of the artist's touch. While Woodard encountered many obstacles in her life, she did not let them stop her. She became the first African-American artist to have a solo exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum in 1935. She organized the Los Angeles Negro Art Association, and she continued to promote other artists while she remained involved in the community. Another of the reasons that this sculpture of Model exudes so much life is because she is not idealized. She looks very much as she did in real life, as seen in this black and white photograph of Model. This realistic approach runs contrary to the mode of representing women that was established in the Renaissance and which continued even into the 20th century. This profile portrait of a woman, painted by Fra Filippo Lippi around 1440 and now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, sums up the issue. The idealized woman, as defined by men, became synonymous with beauty, which left the real woman out of the picture. I particularly like to use this painting by Lippi because if one looks to the left of the composition, one can see a man, her husband or suitor, who stands outside a window looking at the woman, who remains inside the home. The centuries of idealized representations of women by men continues to impact our self-image and our self-esteem. The impact of these romanticized images of women from the past, as well as the new ones produced every day, appearing virtually everywhere, have an effect on us and influence our response to what we see in the mirror, which hasn't had the benefit of airbrushing and a team of beauticians and cosmeticians. The images encourage women to hide imperfections so that they can approximate that ideal vision, which corresponds to the beautiful. The great thing about Model is that she confronts this issue straight on and she wins. Reality can be beautiful. Thus, beauty doesn't only correspond to an ideal vision of what a woman should look like. Beauty comes in an infinite number of variations. This sculpture, by a woman, of a woman, belongs to the 20th century, when women artists finally gained the true, unqualified recognition that they had sought for so long. But what about all the women artists before the 20th century? We know that women practiced a variety of artistic crafts thanks to various ancient writings like those of the Roman historian Pliny. Ancient images of women engaged in artistic pursuits also survive, as seen in this ancient Roman fresco of a woman painter from the Naples National Archaeological Museum, and the female vase painter depicted on a Greek hydria from around 450 before the Common Era from a private collection. Unfortunately, the identities of these women, as well as their artistic production, have more often than not just disappeared. This medieval manuscript page, made around 1200 in France, which is in our collection, can evidence the fact that women artists have been and continue to be overlooked. More often than not, people assume that a man illuminated the page, but what evidence do we have for that? During the medieval period, women were quite active in the production of books. Just as male religious establishments had scriptoria for the production of books, convents could have a room dedicated to the copying and illustrating of manuscripts. While I can't illustrate the early history of women artists with objects from our collection, I still want to briefly show you a few select images of objects in other collections to give you an idea of the breadth and quality of this early activity, while simultaneously laying the groundwork regarding the obstacles women had to overcome. Fortunately, some of these early women artists left traces of their identity, and examples of their artistic production have survived, as seen in this delightful self-portrait of Gouda. Gouda was a German nun working in the 12th century, and she both signed and embedded her portrait in the letter D of the Homilary of St. Bartholomew in the Cathedral of Frankfurt am Main. Pleased with her work and desiring her authorship to be remembered, she included the inscription, "Gouda, a sinful woman, wrote and illuminated this book." The majority of medieval women artists were to be found in the convents, which had the resources for studying and practicing a variety of crafts and the market to sell them. Wealthy women also had access to training and materials, as well as the space and time to produce art, as seen in this illuminated page showing a woman painting from a late medieval copy of Famous Women by Boccaccio. Here, a lady sits on an elegant chair painting an image of the Madonna and Child, while a young apprentice grinds the mineral lapis lazuli, which will be used for the brilliant blue paint of the Virgin's robe. This book was one of the first catalogues of women to argue for women's deeds, both famous and infamous ones. Famous did not equal virtuous for Boccaccio, and the book did not defend women against a misogynistic tradition. While women were flawed by nature, according to Boccaccio, they could also provide praiseworthy examples at times. With regard to women in art, Boccaccio wrote, I thought that these achievements were worthy of some praise, for art is very much alien to the mind of woman, and these things cannot be accomplished without a great deal of talent, which in women is usually very scarce. Boccaccio also described a specific set of character traits for the ideal woman, who had to be gentle, modest, honest, dignified, elegant in speech, pious, generous, chaste, and skilled in household management. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Boccaccio's model was in place and continued. In 1521, the famous German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer, in response to his purchase of an illumination done by the 18-year-old Netherlandish artist Susanna Hordenbout, commented in his diary as follows: "It is a great marvel that a woman should do so much." While her illuminations are lost to us, this episode and information about the Hornbout family helps us understand two important facts regarding women artists of the early modern period. Firstly, Susanna was one of the many successful early women artists who developed her skill and practiced her craft within the context of a family workshop. Secondly, we see that the measure of artistic achievement was the male artistic genius. Exceptional women artists of the Renaissance, like Properzia de Rossi, a sculptor from Bologna, are genuinely praised by the 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari. Here, I show you a terrific relief sculpture of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, sculpted around 1520, now in the Museum of San Petronio in Bologna, as an example of de Rossi's technical and artistic skill. In addition to showing artistic talent, women artists were required to conform to certain social expectations and duties associated with their class. Men can acquire nobility through the practice of art, while women are permitted to practice art because they are of noble birth or noble deportment, which is instilled in childhood. The learning and intellectual skill of women are subordinated to their virtue and social behavior. As a result, in his discussion about Properzia de Rossi in his Vitae, or Lives of the Artists, Vasari also discusses that she was excellent in household manners, that she was beautiful, and that she sang better than any other woman of the city. Lastly, while women are capable of excellence, they lack artistic genius, which is the prerogative of men. I take the time to single out the way women artists are treated in Vasari's publication because it became the model for later chroniclers, both in the reception of art made by women and in the characterization of women artists from the 16th to the 20th centuries. Not only did women have to deal with the male viewpoint that the female sex was flawed, they also frequently lacked access to professional training. The two primary exceptions were women who belonged to convents and women who trained in their family workshops. The Italian artist Lavinia Fontana can serve as an example of what female artists were able to achieve when permitted access to the necessary artistic education. She and other talented women artists found success in the Renaissance, creating significant pieces both for religious institutions and private patrons who marveled at the craftsmanship of a woman. While our collection doesn't currently have any Renaissance art created by a woman, we can begin our own story in the 17th century with an engraving by the Italian artist Teresa del Po, showing the tomb of Pope Julius II, printed in 1677. Teresa came from a Roman family of artists, and her father served as her instructor. She is said to have engraved in the manner of her father so closely that it was difficult to distinguish between them. While she was elected to the Academy of St. Luke in Rome in 1675, not once did she attend any of their meetings, probably owing to the discomfort to be felt in a primarily male institution. 16th and 17th century Italian writers continued to record the achievements of a few of the women artists, but this was often done in relation to the glorification of a city. This print faithfully records Michelangelo's unfinished tomb of Pope Julius II, and is thus a reproductive print. Interest in the art of Michelangelo continued long after his death, and prints such as these satisfied the needs of collectors and visitors to Rome, who wanted to remember this late piece by Michelangelo. While 19th century reference books noted that she had painted in oil and etched a few plates in the style of her father, we have recently discovered in the last 20 years that she more importantly painted pastel portraits and portrait-like heads of saints, which played an important role in the early development of pastel portraiture, a genre which flourished later in the 18th century. The Dutch artist Gertrude Abercrombie also practiced within the workshop of her family in Amsterdam. This piece comes from a series of 14 prints called Pleasant Landscapes, which she etched around 1645, after drawings by her brother Roland Roegman, when she was about 20 years of age. Her technique is a studied one, where the etched lines recall those used in the tedious and difficult technique of engraving. It is interesting to note that our print still contains her monogram, GR. Sometimes her monogram was changed in subsequent centuries to read RR in order to attribute the print to her brother, Roland Roquemont, thus erasing her presence in the creative process. This is just another one of the difficulties in trying to recover the art of women. She was one of the few women printmakers active in Holland in the 17th century, and she was involved in the creation of a variety of prints, some after designs by her brother and others after her own invention. She is actually best known for her prints depicting women performing various domestic tasks, as seen in these engravings from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. During the 18th century, things did not improve for women artists. They were barred from the academies in Rome and Paris, the major centers for acquiring an artistic education. This meant that they were also excluded from the current theoretical and intellectual debates. Unable to take life drawing classes, they remained unprepared to depict the human figure. Therefore, they weren't trained to paint history paintings, which were considered the most significant type of art being produced at that time. And while women were celebrated in the 18th century, the critique of them formed the basis for aesthetic judgments about art. Charles Cochin warned artists against applying color like a woman applying makeup. Rousseau, an 18th century philosopher and writer, believed in the separation of the workplace and home in modern capitalism, which rationalized the separation and oppression of women. He viewed them as inferior and felt that the sexes should be separated and that women had no capacity to contribute to art and civilization, apart from their domestic role. Finally, femininity became associated with nature, and the art of women was evaluated on what it revealed of femininity. The end result was that women had less and less access to the public sphere, which obviously affected their artistic production. Furthermore, the subject matter was judged in relation to whether it was appropriate and natural for a woman. Basically, this meant that women were not given the freedom to paint whatever they wanted. In the 1770s, the French artist Anne-Geneviève Greuze painted this miniature on a piece of ivory. Her works have faded from our view, both not only because of her famous father, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, but also because she painted in a manner very much like his, which isn't surprising as she was his student. This small piece derives from a famous painting of her father's, which was one of the most admired paintings in the Paris Salon of 1765. It now hangs in the National Gallery of Scotland. Such images of a distressed femininity were appreciated for their idealized beauty and the emotions that moved the viewer. At the same time, they were interpreted as veiled symbols of lost virginity and seen by men as a titillating allegory of the transition from childhood innocence to adult experience. A masterful English printmaker, Anne Allen, who was active in the 1790s, achieved her fame through collaborating with her husband, Jean-Baptiste Piémont. This color etching was made in the à la poupée technique, which describes a method of inking a metal plate using a small ball-shaped wad of fabric known as a poupée, the French word for dolly. Inks of differing colors are applied selectively to the copper, and then the inked plate is printed. Each impression has the appearance of a monoprint and is unique in its coloring. 18th century printmakers invented the technique, and Anne Allen was one of the few women to be practicing it. This colorful print shows two individuals, one of whom appears to be collecting birds at the base of a fanciful stairway that leads to a wispy pavilion. Nestled within a verdant and flowering framework, this kind of delightful fantasy in a Rococo chinoiserie style was very popular in the late 18th century, deriving from the exotic scenes found on Chinese imports and encouraged by the chinoiserie paintings by Jean-Antoine Watteau and François Boucher. Decorators, textile designers, and porcelain factories throughout Europe, where the designs were copied or interpreted according to personal taste, used prints like hers. These two cups by the premier Italian porcelain manufacturer Richard Ginori relied on similar prints by Jean Piémont. The sublimation of the woman artist reached its full extent in the 19th century. The division between potent men and submissive women widened, as did a woman's access to the public realm. Woman's art was biologically determined and an extension of their domestic role. Léon Lagrange sums the scene up best in his 1860 article in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts. Let men conceive of great architectural projects, monumental sculpture, and the most elevated forms of painting. Let women occupy themselves with those types of art which they have always preferred, such as pastels, portraits, and miniatures, or the paintings of flowers, those prodigies of grace and freshness which alone can compete with the grace and freshness of women themselves. While many women artists are lost to history, others leave only a faint echo. Camille Bonnard, who created this image of the Church of St. Ambrose in Milan, traveled to Rome and Florence between 1820 and 1827. While she is recorded as having been a painter, we only find evidence of her works in the realm of prints, like these picturing churches in Italy, which appeared in books. Fortunately, we know much more about the 19th century British artist Louise Rayner. She was a remarkably talented watercolorist, as seen in the exceptional level of detail used to describe the picturesque belfry of the 12th century Church of St. Nicholas near Canterbury and the 14th century banqueting room at Haddon Hall. She came from a family of artists and first studied painting with her father before she began her career painting in oil. Soon thereafter, she chose to concentrate on watercolors, as did her father, and regularly exhibited in this medium. Clearly there were fields of artistic endeavor and subjects that men felt women artists should practice, and history painting was not among them. Perhaps to escape this oppression in France, Sidonie Pétain, who had trained in Paris in the painting of such figural works, came to the United States. Unfortunately, such works found little demand in California, and she turned to the painting of small-scale still lifes, like the one shown here, which found a ready market. Recalling the French tradition of still life painting as practiced by the renowned Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin, our still life with revolver, which was painted about 100 years later in 1861, shows 3 dead snipe, 2 of which hang upside down by their feet. Giving the piece a distinctly American and masculine flavor, Pétain included a Colt Model 1851 revolver and an unrelated leather shot flask with metal measuring device. Finding only a limited market for her art, she returned to France after spending only about 6 months in California. Thereafter, no trace can be found of her. Up to now, she hasn't left a footprint on the web, which is remarkable, and little information exists about her. This may be the result of a subsequent marriage and consequent change of name that would have resulted. Women artists also often stopped making art after they were married. Fortunately, we know significantly more about the American artist Claude Raguet Hirst, who was born in 1855 and died in 1942. Better known as Claudine, this artist signed her name as Claude to conceal her female identity. She was one of the only women artists to paint still lifes in a trompe-l'oeil style. French for fool the eye, these super-realist paintings of everyday objects were part of the vocabulary of American art in the 19th century. Recalling Dutch paintings, these factual works were extremely popular among turn-of-the-century wealthy patrons, which probably inspired Hirst's decision to switch in the early 1890s from depicting flowers, a subject matter suitable for a female artist, to objects belonging to the masculine realm of the study. In this example, she reproduces the title page and engraving from an antique book with such fidelity, one is tempted to turn the page to continue reading more of the comic opera Lionel and Clarissa. Talented women artists like Hirst sold well, but they continue to be considered the exception, as seen in the March 5, 1910 edition of Art News, where a critic recorded, "Not one woman in 100 has a true artistic sense or even a genuine like for the aesthetic in any of its forms." At about the same time, the notable French author Octave Uzan wrote, "The woman genius does not exist. When she does, she is a man." These are clear condemnations of the aesthetic sensibility and thus the ability of women to practice art that endured into the early 20th century. Regardless, more and more women were practicing art, and the increasing demand for art meant that there were more opportunities for them. During the second half of the 19th century, schools of design for women began opening in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, which meant training in drawing and modeling finally began to be offered to women. In the 1880s, modeling classes in the major art academies finally opened to women. During the 20th century, the huge popularity of bronzes gave women new opportunities to become professional sculptors, and these women had access to resources that their predecessors often lacked. Today, no one would dare challenge the aesthetic sensibility of Harriet Whitney Frishmuth. In 1900, she briefly studied in Paris with Rodin. She learned two important things from him. First, always look at the silhouette of a subject and be guided by it. Second, remember that movement is a transition from one attitude to another. It is a bit of what was and a bit of what is to be. In her sculpture Joy of the Waters, done in 1920, you see her love of depicting the human figure in motion. Using a professional dancer as her model, the complicated pose is the result of asking the model to imagine cold water shooting up from the floor. The skillful modeling of the figure's musculature and flesh is the happy result of studying dissection once a week at the College of Physicians and Surgeons for 2 years. Her realistic approach to art, combining classical influences with a European-inspired, stylized and idealized sensibility, found a ready audience, and her sculptures were immensely popular. While Frishmuth preferred to return to the United States after her studies abroad, Mary Cassatt settled in Paris after studying several years in Europe. Her innovative style caught the eye of the artist Edgar Degas, who invited her to show with the Impressionists. In 1880, she joined Degas in a project to create original prints. It is here that she demonstrated herself to be the most daring and innovative printmaker of all of the Impressionists. In Susan Seated Before a Row of Trees, she questions the concept of when a work of art is complete, as she leaves the piece unfinished in order to explore other concerns. A realistic representation of every detail was not her goal. Instead, through foul biting marks and untidy scratches, she gives the piece a spontaneous energy and immediacy. She also implies the flickering, transient aspects of light by illuminating Susan with patches of light and through the energetic and inconsistent diagonal lines. While the print has an overall sparse quality, the use of the dry point technique yields a subtle, rich elegance to the area around Susan's face. This is the result of the metal displaced when the artist draws directly into the metal plate with a needle. The delicate ridges or burr catch more ink and print as velvety dark lines. While an innovative technician who occasionally called attention to the plight of women in her art, Cassatt primarily remained conservative in her subject matter. She focused on the realm of women, which is what her world encouraged. In her own words, quote, "Men, I have no doubt, are painted in all their vigor on the walls of other buildings. To us, the sweetness of childhood, the charm of womanhood, if I have not conveyed some sense of that charm, in one word, if I have not been absolutely feminine, then I have failed." Unquote. In the 18th century, women were faulted by philosophers like Rousseau for their weaker nature and character. But in the 19th century, they were raised on a pedestal, where they were responsible for moralizing society and guarding the domestic realm, which ultimately denied them access to the professional and public realm. Things finally began to change late in the 19th and early 20th centuries. While women still faced opposition from the art establishment, they found innovative ways to circumvent the oppressive system. As the 20th century progressed, women continued to play a larger and larger role in the creation of art, and the different subjects and issues they explored in their art, and the various ways they did this multiplied, as did their numbers. Elizabeth Catlett, one of the leading African-American feminist and political artists of the 20th and 21st centuries, endowed much of her art with a strong political commentary that revolved around the oppression of the blacks and dignity of women. Coming from the series The Negro Woman, Catlett acknowledges the harsh reality of black women's labor. When viewing this striking image, we are invited to join in the artist's identification with her female protagonist by the title, "My Role Has Been Important in the Struggle to Organize the Unorganized." Her style is a blend of the figurative and abstract, which she imbues with a strong social concern. By using the print medium for her message, she utilized the democratic power of printed art to reach a larger number of people with her message and her spectacular aesthetic sensibility. One of her most famous images of female farm workers, the sharecropper, who shows the leathery skin and wrinkles coming from years of toil, testifies to the injustices of the sharecropper system that came after the Civil War, which trapped African Americans and white workers in a cycle of poverty that left them shackled to the land. Instead of showing the worker destroyed by the system, Catlett endows her with the strength, dignity, and heroism typically reserved for powerful individuals. Likewise, Faith Ringgold, another African-American artist, sought to establish a strong identity for African-American women in the contemporary art world. She is best known for her large painted story quilts, a medium linked to women's work, and this lithograph derives from one of those paintings. The African-American community has a long tradition of quilt making, influenced by the weaving that was done by men in Africa, which was brought by the slaves to America, where women continued the tradition. These quilts served a variety of purposes, providing warmth, memorializing events, telling stories, and as message boards for the Underground Railroad. This piece comes from a series called The French Connection, which comments on the themes of race and gender in relation to the art world. While European civilization had despised Africans as savages, they ironically used African art in the creation of a modern civilized art. In contrast to such prejudice, this piece features 8 African-American women quilters who proudly display their sunflower quilt, while the famous French post-impressionist artist Vincent van Gogh stands quietly in the background, almost hidden within a field of sunflowers. This also references the brilliant flowers found in some of his paintings. If one looks closely, one sees that each quilter is actually a portrait of a famous African-American woman freedom fighter, including Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Rosa Parks. In the words of Ringgold, my ideas come from reflecting on my life and the lives of people I have known and have been in some way inspired by. This composition innovatively explores the historical position of African-American women in history and art in the language of an African-American craft tradition, and finally, in relation to the European artistic tradition. When one understands the language, art has the ability to have a great impact. Other women used photography in order to express themselves and communicate their message. Diane Arbus was a pivotal figure in 20th century documentary photography. There is nothing romantic about her work. Instead, her images possess a raw intensity, which derives from her taking the photograph at a close range. The uncropped edges of the resulting photo further indicate a lack of artistic intervention. The photograph portrays mental patients from a New Jersey hospital on a Halloween outing. Expelled from society and locked up behind walls, they are potentially some of her most abject compositions. In contrast to this assumption, the people portrayed aren't sad and they don't worry about their condition, as they proudly display the Halloween costumes they wear. They are who they are, and the portrait shows them as such. Instead of empathizing with a condition she cannot understand, Arbus explained in 1960 that, "What I'm trying to describe is that it's impossible to get out of your skin into somebody else's. That somebody else's tragedy is not the same as your own." This photograph is beautiful, dignified, and again, highly meaningful. Margaret Bourke-White was one of the trailblazers of photojournalism at a time when few women worked as professional photographers. By the mid-1930s, she was one of the highest paid photographers in the United States. While known for her commercial photographs, she became interested in Depression-era suffering. Shot in the poverty-stricken rural South, Bourke-White saw religion as a virus that added to the sickness of the South. Evangelical Protestantism was portrayed as robbing people of their intelligence and replacing it with religious passion. Whether one agrees with his feeling about religion or not, the image is a strong one, showing these impoverished people with respect as it records a central part of their lives. Carrie Mae Weems, an African-American artist, innovatively used photographs, text, and audio recordings to explore themes of racism and identity from a personal and historical perspective. She asks us to reflect on the past and the African slave trade in her Grabbing, Snatching, and Blink You Be Gone triptych, or 3-part composition. The photographs depict abandoned slave prisons off the coast of Senegal, which served as a holding place for thousands of kidnapped West Africans before they were shipped to America to become slaves. The combination of photographs and text make the message strikingly and poetically clear. The slave trade from Gorée Island stopped in 1815 when France definitively abolished slavery. The German artist Käthe Kollwitz used the dramatic power of black and white drawings and lithography, which could cheaply reproduce her compositions to make her political message. The Political Agitator, made in 1926, during a period of cataclysmic political and social upheaval in Germany, depicts a figure with clenched fists trying to take an assertive step forward. The gaunt, almost skeletal face and emaciated body reveal the helplessness of his actual condition. An anonymous representative of the poor, images like this called attention to the impoverished and powerless working classes. A universal image of social consciousness imbued with an emotional depth and intensity, the message continues to resonate even today. Kollwitz's success as a print artist led to important advances for women artists, as evidenced by her admission to and appointment as professor in 1919 at the Berlin Academy of Art. At Hitler's rise to power in 1933, however, she was asked to leave the academy, and the state subsequently made it difficult for her to exhibit. While she left Berlin in 1943, much of her art was lost with the destruction of her house in the same year. Artists such as Grace Hartigan were also involved in the New York avant-garde artistic scene of the 1940s and 1950s, although their male counterparts frequently overshadowed them. Hartigan moved to New York in 1946, and soon after that, Jackson Pollock debuted his new drip paintings in 1948. The abstract expressionists who had been experimenting for years exploded onto the world art scene. Hartigan was profoundly influenced by Pollock's solo exhibition, and her earliest works from 1948 to 1952 were large-scale abstract canvases that recalled those of Pollock and William de Kooning. Responding to the burst of creativity that surrounded her, Hartigan's paintings reveal a remarkable energy in the large gestural brushstrokes, bright colors, and sense of texture. Called the Gallo Ball, Hartigan innovatively introduced the element of collage into this painting by incorporating pieces of newspaper, which were then covered with bright colors. It's a remarkable record of a talented young female artist responding to the latest artistic developments in New York City. She was the only woman artist who participated in the famous New American Painting International Exhibition organized by the Museum of Modern Art in 1958 and 1959. Irene Rice Pereira was one of the foremost modernists of the 20th century. Unfortunately, geometric abstraction, which had appeared on the art scene during the 1910s, disappeared into the background with the arrival of the eye-catching and attention-grabbing large-scaled abstract expressionist works. This is an excellent example of rectilinear geometric abstraction, which was influenced by Cubism, Russian constructivism, and the art of Piet Mondrian and the artists of the Bauhaus. Entitled Triangles, Pereira explores the issues of timelessness and endlessness in this intriguing composition. Thanks to her sophisticated use of color, pattern, light and shade, various rectilinear forms, and parallel and diagonal lines, she endows the piece with a remarkable depth. The longer one studies this work of art, the more one apprehends the complex spatial movements that recede and project at a variety of angles. Pereira liked to experiment with abstraction in order to clarify issues encountered in pictorial representations. Indeed, compositions like this one are a metaphor of the unknowable and immeasurable infinity of space, a concern which stemmed from Pereira's personal, scientific, and mystical investigations. Such pieces were also a remedy to what she felt was a European angst brought to our shores in the wake of the Holocaust, which had introduced a cynicism and a profoundly anti-female sensibility that boded ill for art in America. She also stated that while the works of art created by women were acquired by museums, they were rarely shown. Helen Frankenthaler was another groundbreaking artist as well as trendsetter. A proponent of abstract expressionism, she extended Pollock's technique of painting on unprimed canvases. She allowed thinner pigments to soak directly into the canvas, thus creating an intricate bond between image and support. As a result, the colors seemed to float in an undefined space. In 1953, the artists Morris Louis and Kenneth Noland both visited Frankenthaler's New York studio to study her staining technique, with which they both subsequently experimented. This print in the museum's collection, a lithographing etching executed later in the 1980s by Frankenthaler, shows her continuing interest in meditating on the ambiguities of space. Frankenthaler does this on two levels in this composition. She first considers the relationships between the linear threads and skeins that appear to radiate light as they float before a dense black background. The shifting relationship of these amorphous forms to the framing edge is then explored by means of the bright red border. Throughout her career, Frankenthaler experimented with form and materials as she continually questioned the relationship of foreground and background and the nature of space in her art. The British sculptor Barbara Hepworth produced some of the earliest abstract sculptures in England. She maintained a lifelong friendship with the artist Henry Moore, and their reciprocal influence was an important aspect of the parallel development in their careers. This lithograph comes from a suite of 12 prints called the Aegean Suite, created in 1971. In this series, Hepworth made analogies between the formal precision of geometric forms and famous sites of Greek culture. This composition, however, is only a fragment, which is also its title, and thus cannot be linked to a specific locale. Nonetheless, the elegant swirling brown ink of the background recalls a rich brown marble, while the uncolored semicircles reference the pure white marble quarried in ancient Greece and the sculptures that were carved from it. An exceptionally refined composition, the piece is a very interesting example of a sculptor's response to the two-dimensional realm of prints, and exhibits a presence on the level with a sculpture. Adaline Kent was a sculptor of great originality. While deeply rooted in Surrealism, she was simultaneously influenced by the wave of abstraction hitting California in the 1930s. This combination of stylistic influences resulted in unique and moving works of art. Standing more than 3 feet tall, this untitled piece recalls the vertebra of a massive beast. The forms appear grounded in reality, but the anthropomorphic inventiveness gives the piece an unreal and enigmatic quality. Stripped of any soft tissue, the stark forms represent all that remains of some mighty beast. Combining what almost appears real with the bizarre, the piece causes a feeling of disorientation as it speaks to the subconscious directly. Gertrude Abercrombie, an American painter, was also deeply influenced by Surrealism. In particular, she admired the art of René Magritte, and her work shows a similar sense of stillness and isolation, lack of shadows, and airless setting. She never linked herself with the Surrealists, however, considering herself a Midwestern artist with deep roots in the city of Chicago. Her naive style also sets her apart. Like the Surrealists, though, she developed a vocabulary of archetypal personal emblems. In this painting, the barren tree, crescent moon, owl, and door combine to create an ambiguous setting that is both inside and outside at the same time. The elongated figure with her hair caught in the keyhole of the door is a self-portrait, as related by the artist. Quote, "It's always myself that I paint, but not actually, because I don't look that good or cute. Everything is autobiographical in a sense, but kind of dreamy." Unquote. She is known for her subtly and richly colored images of deeply personal and evocative imagery. In 1930, Norma Bassett Hall was among the founding members of the Kansas-based Prairie Printmakers and was also the only woman in the group. Along with many women artists, she expressed an appreciation of natural and man-made landscapes. She is famous for her color woodcuts using a Japanese method of printing woodcuts with transparent watercolors and rice paper, which she learned during her trip to Europe between 1925 and 27. Following this, she used the technique exclusively for her color block prints, employing as many as 6 or 7 colors, each of which would have required a separate hand-cut hardwood block. This print shows her full command of the complicated technique as seen in the precise details and the indication of the strong light of the Mediterranean sun. Suzanne Stevenson reveals her love of the creative process through her clay vessels made on a potter's wheel. Her work expresses itself through the unique physical form of each piece, which reveals her hand and personal choices in the irregular modeling and the thickly applied color slips. Color theory also plays a role in her art, and in this piece, she developed the overall color scheme to incorporate a large area of white, which tends to make forms feel larger. This is then balanced and minimized by the expressive bright and dark coloristic brushstrokes surrounding it. Using a complex process, she developed the colors seen here through a series of colored clay slits and glazes. The viewer's eye mixes the colors which are placed next to each other. Such juxtapositions create a vibrancy that mixed colors cannot achieve. Maria Martinez is probably the most famous American Indian artist of the 20th century. She spent the entire 99 years of her life in the place where she was born, 20 miles from Santa Fe, New Mexico. In contrast to Stevenson's clash of colors, Martinez uses a more subtle approach with her black-on-black plate made around 1940. Her tribe recognized her for her exceptional skills by the age of 13. This beautiful and subtle kind of monochromatic pottery is the result of a collaboration with her husband, Julian Martinez. Together, they revived an ancient local technique for making all-black pottery, where some areas have a matte finish and other sections are a glossy jet black. This pattern is inspired by prehistoric designs and features a perfectly crafted radiating feather pattern. Pottery has been an important part of her culture for more than 2,000 years. Following traditional ways, many members of her extended family were involved in the making of pots. She learned to make pottery by watching her aunt and grandmother. In her seriograph Cure Heal, made in 1992, Lorna Simpson focuses on the gender-specific object of the high-heeled shoe. Overriding the boundaries of race, the high-heeled shoes are an immediately recognizable aspect of feminine attire. She focuses on these gendered objects to comment on the assumptions made about women in relation to their physical appearance. She is questioning the language of stereotypes, which so often leads to incorrect assumptions. The work doesn't give an answer. It is intentionally left open-ended. With a career spanning over 50 years, Nancy Sparrow's work was groundbreaking, and the work of many other artists would not exist without her efforts. With her hand-printed banner, "We Come Full Circle." Made in 1996, Sacred and Profane 2 shows a feminist artist reacting to the secondary place of women. In society, the universal is the male. In her work, she tries to turn this around and universalize the female using a medium not typically associated with male artists. She co-opts images from a variety of time periods and cultures from around the globe to indicate the significant presence of women throughout time and the world. The activities shown are both famous and infamous ones. In her words, quote, "I have deliberately attempted to distance my art from the Western emphasis on the subjective portrayal of individuality by using a hand-printing and collage technique. Woman as activator or protagonist, dancing in procession, elegiac or celebrator, a continuous presence, engaged directly or glimpsed peripherally. The eye, as a moving camera, scans the re-imaging of women." Unquote. What Nancy Sparrow was protesting can best be summarized in the 17th century Baroque Flemish painting by a man showing King Solomon worshipping idols, also from our collection. Solomon, the son of David and Bathsheba, was the richest, most powerful, and wisest ruler of Israel. Dressed in a golden robe trimmed with ermine, he kneels in the center of the painting in the act of worshipping pagan idols. This act of faithlessness eventually leads to disaster for Israel. As I am describing this scene, I hope that you are noticing another important element to this narrative. The individual responsible for this disastrous action is a woman, Solomon's first Egyptian wife, who stands behind him. The centuries of accretion of such negative stereotypes of women are not easy to shake, and still far too often accepted or simply just ignored. Although it may seem from this cursory chronological review that women today are free to create whatever they want, stereotypes of women still exist in our society, which often influence us and guide our choices in unseen ways. These stereotypes can also affect the interpretation of art by women. In addition to this, while the past continues to be relevant, some individuals and groups seek a return to the past with its related marginalization of women. Art continues to be an effective vehicle to question the world around us. In relation to women and the art that they create, I hope that this presentation causes you to re-examine the world around you and to question assumptions that many of us make without even realizing it.